Israel has bombed several key targets in Gaza in retaliation for what it says was a Hamas rocket attack early Monday morning. Israeli officials say a rocket fired from the Gaza Strip struck a house in central Israel, wounding 7 people. The violence prompted Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to cut short a visit to Washington. Joining me now to discuss this is Dan Raviv. Dan is the author of several books on the Middle East. He is also a former CBS News correspondent who is now the senior Washington correspondent for I-24 News. Dan, thanks so much for joining us. Why is this conflict between Hamas and Israel heating up again?
Well, of course, from time to time, it happens. It seems to be connected with the Israeli election, just 2 weeks away on April 9th. That is to say that someone in the Gaza Strip, we don't know if it's high up in the Hamas movement, which governs that territory, or someone actually low down who has access to a missile firing facility, decided to push the button. One long-range missile actually flew more than 50 miles, and that's a big deal in that part of the world. More than 50 miles, not really aimed with any precision, but it hit a house. It wounded 7 Israelis, and right away it became the big issue in Israel, especially considering that there is an election campaign. So the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, felt that he had to respond. He said publicly he would respond with force. And you know where he was, here in Washington, D.C., to attend the AIPAC conference, that pro-Israel lobby here. And he was at the White House visiting President Trump. So everything became related with domestic politics in Israel. President Trump trying to show he's a big friend of the Israelis. And so he basically said that Israel can do whatever it wants to protect itself. And all of this basically makes Netanyahu look good as he runs for re-election. Elaine?
Well, Dan, do you foresee this escalating into something bigger? And could Israel send ground troops into Gaza?
You can never be sure, but frankly, no Israeli politician would want to send in ground troops because people will die, a lot of people, and maybe even Israeli forces. And during an election campaign, what Israeli prime minister would want to see that happen? So it's much better, certainly from a political point of view, to use Israel's Air Force, to use drones, to use helicopter attacks where they can hit selected targets in the Gaza Strip. Israel prides itself on not hitting just whole civilian neighborhoods, though, of course, civilians do often die in these attacks. So Israel says with precision it's been taking out targets of the radical Hamas faction that runs Gaza. And Hamas and others in the Gaza Strip, they say they're ready for war. But I don't think either side really wants one, at least not right now, Elaine.
Dan, I also want to ask you about another development. President Trump on Monday signed an order which recognizes Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Can you remind us, Dan, where that region is and give us a brief history about the conflict over it?
Well, if you know anything about the map of Israel, which is a very narrow country, and it's been an independent country since 1948, in a sense it got wider or fatter in 1967 in the Six-Day War, where Israel fought its neighbors and captured territory from Egypt, from Jordan, and from Syria. From Syria, Israel captured the Golan Heights. And since then, the Israelis intended to stay there. But from time to time, they suggested they would negotiate with the Syrian government because, you know, Israel made peace with Egypt and returned the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. But the Syrian-Israeli negotiations never worked out. So in recent years, especially with the Syrian civil war, all the unrest, even Iranian forces now in Syria, the Israelis say that they would never leave the Golan Heights. And obviously, in private talks with President Trump, Netanyahu persuaded Trump that Israel's going to stay there, that it's important to Israel's security and even for regional stability. So those are the words that President Trump used in his presidential proclamation. The U.S. recognizes that that land belongs to the state of Israel. Now, that's not binding under international law. It doesn't require an act of Congress. It's not the U.S. that draws the maps of Israel. But again, it's showing that Donald Trump feels very friendly toward Israel and toward Netanyahu, leading all of us to conclude that Trump really wants Netanyahu to win the election on April 9th.
Well, Dan, how could this move affect future peace negotiations in the Middle East?
Well, that's an interesting question because you can't be sure. Sometimes things happen in the Middle East and we think, oh, my, all the Arabs will be angry. Saudi Arabia will protest and Iraq will be angry at the U.S. But then sometimes those things don't happen. Now, there are certainly Palestinian activists, and there are pro-Palestinians here in America, too, who say one thing that's terrible about President Trump recognizing that Israel can keep the Golan Heights forever is, what if Israel decides it wants to keep the West Bank forever, right? The Israelis often use the old Jewish biblical names, Judea and Samaria, and pointing out that ancient Jewish kingdoms were there. So what if Netanyahu wants to keep and annex the West Bank? Will President Trump recognize that? So that's troubling to a lot of people. Keep in mind the Trump White House is committed to putting out a peace plan for Israelis and Palestinians a few months from now. The president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, working on that. This move, by being so friendly toward Israel and recognizing the permanence of Israel holding some land it captured in '67, it seems to damage peace prospects. But you never know. Other people say it warns the Palestinians that if they don't rush and make a deal, then Israel might keep the land forever. Elaine?
So, Dan, you noted the political context here, the president signing this proclamation during a visit by Benjamin Netanyahu just 2 weeks before the prime minister faces new elections. So was this effectively a campaign stop for the prime minister?
Oh, it was from the beginning, even without any attack by Hamas with a rocket that hurt 7 Israelis. Just the fact that Netanyahu was coming to Washington so close to election time in order to be cheered at the AIPAC convention. Now, that convention took place Sunday and Monday. On Tuesday morning, Netanyahu was going to be there with 18,000 pro-Israel Americans cheering him. Well, he'll miss that. He felt he had to rush home. He also holds the post of defense minister, so he's rushing home. Plans were being laid for him to address the AIPAC conference by satellite, but it's not the same. Either way, there's no question that the trip to Washington to demonstrate that Netanyahu has a uniquely strong friendship with the President of the United States helps Netanyahu with most Israeli voters. The United States is the absolute vital ally to Israel. So most Israelis say, wow, if we have a prime minister who's that close to the White House, that's probably a good thing. It's going to help Netanyahu in the election.
All right, Dan Raviv. Dan, good to see you. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. Nice to see you.